Hi everyone, and thank you for joining me for this next video. And what I wanted to do today is present a paper that I presented at the CXS conference in 2023, which I've got a link to in the description below. And this paper was responding to one of the conference themes, which was the 50th anniversary of the Exorcist film. This is the angle I took. So the Exorcist franchise emerged from this film, William Friedkin's 1973 film. There were two more films, sort of in that immediate sort of response. Then there was a slate of three legacy sequels that were meant to have come, of course, after the poor reception of A Believer. That's not going to happen. There's now a talk of a new one with Scarlett Johansson in a role. And then there was a TV series as well. That brought back the character of Reagan in disguise. What I wanted to do was not really discuss any of the canonical films, but rather make the case for an extra addition to the Exorcist franchise, and this is the other film that you see on the right there, the 1990 parody film Repossessed. So the film is clearly a comedy version drawing on The Exorcist, and it subverts loads of the iconic moments in the film for humour. But I argue that it also occupies quite an interesting space as kind of almost a pseudo-sequel to the 1973 film. And it presents a narrative that is, to all intents and purposes, clearly designed as a return to the world of The Exorcist, rather than sort of occupying the more conventional parodic approach of recreating and subverting the text in itself. So what I want to do is talk about a number of examples that facilitate this reading, and then I want to sort of dig into one of the most interesting connections between the two films, that is, how they treat religion, and specifically the ways that they hold the mirror up to contemporary challenges faced by Christianity, albeit in sort of quite different ways and based on their sort of different genre identities. So effectively, I make the case for the parody as both a hidden gem in the Exorcist franchise and quite an incisive religious commentary. So generally speaking, the film, if you haven't seen it, follows quite a similar narrative thrust to the original. The character of Nancy Aglett, played by Linda Blair, is possessed by a demon. A team of priests try and conduct an exorcism to help save her soul. It's not a sustained analysis, but Dan Harris, in his sort of canonical work on parody, references the film, and he cites a number of examples in which Repossessed presents and then reiterates moments from the original film to subvert them for humour. The possessed Nancy screams and writhes on her bed, screaming, "Make it stop, make it stop." Her husband then enters and turns off the bed's vibrate function. Similarly, Nancy mocks the priest with the cry, "Lick me, lick me," for a cut to reveal that the demon has transformed into a giant ice cream. Pivotal moments in the climax, the demon laughing after the older priest is killed, and the younger priest demanding that the demon takes him instead, they're reiterated here for comedic effect. There is even what Harris describes as an example of parody, referring to our audience knowledge of the production behind the original, and its famous use of pea soup as vomit. So Nancy's family fancy a spot of pea soup after she's possessed, and later on in the exorcism scene, after the demon throws up on Father May-I, the character played by Leslie Nielsen, he then returns the favour, vomiting up more pea soup, and asking the demon if it likes a taste of its own medicine. So these are a few examples. My role here is not really to list examples of the ways that Repossessed parodies the original. This is necessarily a function of parodic text, but it is somewhat unique in the way that it brings back and really centralises one of the stars of the source text and makes central their role in the parody. This is Linda Blair as Nancy Aglett. So it's clear for all intents and purposes that Nancy is meant to be Regan McNeil. Even through a juxtaposition of their first names, Nancy Reagan. It's a connection and a bit of wordplay at the same time. This is an example of what Harris calls reiteration. That is specifically evoking the earlier text in such a way that it will be recognised by an informed audience. So it creates both a connection with the object of the parody, and it establishes a set of narrative or generic conventions, which will then be played with for comedic effect. It's key to note, though, that the parody is not simply retelling the story of The Exorcist. Instead, it's a comedic retelling of something that has happened before in the world of the film itself. So the Nancy character was possessed earlier in the film. We see sort of this in the intro, and then this happens again. So although it presents as a parody, the key role of the returning star and also the film sort of building on, rather than reiterating and transforming the same narrative, are strategies that I think are sort of more commonly associated with the sequel than sort of the typical parody. Let me leap ahead to sort of talking about faith and religion. So given the nature of the film and the uproar surrounding its exhibition in 1973, it's not an out there conclusion to state that the depiction of religion and faith is a central tenet of The Exorcist. The scholarship and fan writing is mixed on exactly where the film sits here, whether the film is pro or anti-religion, and this is quite a big sort of sticking point and sort of one that is still argued. The Reverend Billy Graham famously said that, quote, "the devil is in every frame," end quote, of the movie, and that there could be no possible benefit to viewing a depiction of evil. Elsewhere, Pauline Kael's review of The Exorcist attacked the Catholic Church for allowing the film to be made, saying, quote, "surely it is the religious people who should be most offended by this movie. Others can laugh it off as garbage, but there are American Catholics willing to see their faith turned into a horror movie show. Are they willing to accept anything just as long as their church comes out in a good light?" End quote. And despite these views at the time, I think the film ultimately falls on the side of religion, and the demon is defeated. Father Karras embraces his faith to the fullest in a moment of Christ-like sacrifice. There is some research conducted by Amy C. Chambers that suggests the response was not nearly as reactionary on the side of the Catholic Church and the Vatican, which broadly interpreted it as pro-religious, rather than sort of them being solely condemnatory of this film as sort of some sort of heretical text. In a sense, Chris McNeil, the character played by Ellen Burstyn, Regan's mother in the film, is in many ways the kind of person that the film was aimed at. So although religion is still present in US society at the time, adults are becoming increasingly secularist, modernist, losing touch with Christianity, even though they still sort of understood the main tenets. Now, it's worth noting that half of The Exorcist is the characters coming to terms with what is actually happening with Regan. She loses control of her body, and it's only after the medical and the psychological exams fail that Chris looks to the church. And the church itself is sort of initially doesn't believe in the possibility of possession. So exorcism was at this time a mostly forgotten concept, but the scare the film created clearly demonstrates sort of the pervasive nature of faith in the US of the 1970s. So you have that famous shot of Father Merrin, the Max von Sydow character, outside the house, which Mark Kermode describes in his book on the film as one of anticipation on the part of the audience, perhaps hoping that religion and faith will succeed where science has failed. Merrin and Karras are both presented compassionately, their warmth and their human struggles quite a stark contrast to the uncaring doctor's spaces and the inhuman beeps of medical machinery. The film's tagline suggests that it exists, quote, "somewhere between science and superstition," end quote, the idea that both are being seen as fallible institutions. It's noteworthy only one succeeds in the end, of course, but both follow similar processes. They search for alternatives, they search for evidence, rather than immediately inclining towards the worst case scenario. So, how does a parody film sort of compare to this? So obviously Father May I and Father Brophy, it's seen there on the right, are intended as stand-ins for Fathers Merrin and Karras in Friedkin's film. Father May I has a heart condition, Father Brophy has a seeming crisis of faith. These are plot points that are sort of almost entirely lifted from the original. In Brophy's case, the devil reveals him, essentially he was so stupid he could only become a priest or join the US Congress. However, in the climax of the film, with Karras falling down the stairs after he takes the demon into his own body, is presented in sort of an exaggerated function at the beginning of Repossessed. May I conducts this original exorcism and then falls for at least 10 times longer down the stairs. Again, this is the climax of the original exorcism, supporting my contention that the parody film is essentially a narrative that is sequential to the 1973 original. Doctors are once again both the first point of call and unable to help. They reveal their lack of answers via a game show sound effect, as you see on here, proclaiming, quote, "we're all stumped." You might recognise here the Doctor Robert Fuller. He appeared famously in the long-running series Emergency, so again sort of this metatextual casting. After this, a selection of gags that comes comparatively early in the film. This lasts less than 5 minutes, the sort of the medical portion of Repossessed. Nancy then turns to the church. However, there is a significant point of diversion when discussing religious readings of Repossessed, and that is the introduction of two other religious characters in this film, with no real parallels to the 1973 film. In this case, the married televangelist couple, Ernest and Fanny Ray Weller, on the right here, played by Ned Beatty and Lana Schwab. Now, whatever the state of Christianity in the US at the time, there was one major story linked of religion in the news, and that is then the duo's obvious parodic target, and the famous televangelist Jim and Tammy Faye Bakker. These guys are much more famous in the US. If any of my viewers sort of are in the US and sort of recognise it, please do comment below. For a UK audience, you're likely going to be familiar with them as a result of Jessica Chastain's Oscar success in the eyes of Tammy Faye. Now that story is quite an interesting one. I'm going to give a very, very potted history. I'm going to put some references down below that sort of go into it in greater detail. So the couple founded a TV show called the PTL Club in 1974. This idea was that it was essentially a Christian version of The Tonight Show, and it was a major, major hit. Although its programming time was increasingly cut until 1981 because of other network commitments. Their ministry was a multi-million-dollar business, but then it came crashing down in the late 1980s. So Tammy Faye was treated for drug dependency, and then Jim faced allegations of sexual assault from a young church secretary. There was a government investigation into the pair. Jim was indicted for numerous financial crimes, and this led to a divorce. Tammy Faye would remarry. Her next husband was also briefly imprisoned for bankruptcy fraud, and she eventually died of cancer in July of 2007. Jim, meanwhile, is about. He has a new show promoting preparation for the end times. In recent years, he has been sued for offering a product that he said could cure COVID with no side effects. So, as you see from the timeline, sort of Jim being indicted in 1989, Repossessed was made and released just after the Bakker Empire had crashed down, and this parody then would have been very, very pertinent to the US audience at the time. But what's worth noting is, unlike the by then sort of typical parodic performance of May I by Leslie Nielsen, the comedic naivety of Brophy, there is very, very little sympathy in how the Wellers are framed. Beatty's performance, a surprisingly understated one for a parody of this nature, is concerned solely with money. He convinces fathers Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, but refuses to believe that Nancy's possession is real. His first instinct is how it can be exploited for money. Indeed, in the telephone with the demon, he offers it tips on how to be more photogenic in order that it can attract more donations. There is a reference to Ernst's indiscretion with a choir boy hurting the church's funding, to the extent that the writing on the road is literally, quote, "Your ministry is history." After Brophy confronts May I at a gym during a training montage, informs him about Ernest's plan to exorcise the demon alive on the Tarathon, the older priest angrily dismisses him as a charlatan and a hypocrite. Once the money element is mentioned, May I adds, quote, "The man is a thief, he's a swindler, he's a crook posing as a man of God." So as parodies go then, Ernest is quite a scathing one, a corrupt religious figure who would literally do a deal with the devil to help line his own pockets. If Ernest is intended as quite a negative evocation of Jim Bakker, as I think is sort of clearly the point, the film reserves a particular cruelness for its depiction of Tammy Faye through the character of Fanny Ray. She's portrayed as painfully stupid, boasting an annoying laugh. She's ready to follow her husband's every instinct. Make no mistake about it, in Repossessed, Ernest has all the agency, and he's able to convince his wife of the most outrageous statements in what feels like quite a distinct commentary on the Bakker trials. A common retort at the time was, how could she have not known what was going on? In one sequence, an increasingly annoyed Ernest is fed up with his wife's pet dog. He throws it from the couple's limousine into a nearby wood chipper, complete with comedy sound effects. Despite shredded dog and fur chunks literally coating the limo, Ernest gets away without answering. He later feeds another dog into a snake basket during the telethon after it tries to bite him. The Wellers are kicked out of the studio by the demon after they've served their purpose, generating an audience for worldwide possession. And the way this occurs is worthy of commentary. After the demon ponders, quote, "What do I do with a couple of jackasses like you?" end quote. And then the pair are transformed into a pantomime horse. It carries with it connotations of performance and mockery. So in their final act then, the couple become something that I read as emblematic of the then contemporary views of the backers. Damage done, they indiscreetly enter the stage and we don't see them again. Ultimately, however, religion does win the day. So at the start of the exorcism, featuring sort of a Tubular Bells inspired musical cue, May I tells Brophy, quote, "We have the Bible, we have our faith, and as a backup, these beauties," before, as you see on the picture on the left, holding up a pair of baseball bats. None of those tricks work, but when May I learns that the devil isn't a fan of rock and roll, he performs the song "Devil with a Blue Dress On" with a band of religious leaders, including the Pope on electric guitar and the Dalai Lama on keyboard. Although May I and Brophy are Christian priests, it's an assorted faith group that defeats the devil. Faith, and genuine faith, rather than the tarnished brand offered by the backers and the Wellers, ultimately defeats the demon. So my view that Repossessed offers this level of satirical commentary is consolidated by a framing device within the film, in which the story we witness is being presented by May I to a class of young students and ostensibly to the viewer. As you see here, sort of the Nielsen character is effectively looking through the screen at the audience. This is hardly the first time that the film breaks immersion, transgressing the boundaries of the closed world of the film in a number of ways. The most famous of which is the Nancy character quite literally breaking the film in order to demonstrate her demonic power. I'm also a fan of the brief cutback to the class immediately after this moment, in which Nielsen, not May I, but Nielsen, is on the phone to his agent, discussing his next project and meeting someone for dinner. The blurring of the lines then between the filmic and the real is a common feature of parody, but because many of these blurring moments exist in these interludes, sort of almost divorced from the main narrative, it means that many of May I's positive ruminations on faith may seem directly intended for a real audience rather than the in-world one. So here we are, this has been a bit of a brief run through Repossessed, bringing out some interesting connections that arise from its unique status as both parody and sequel in spirit. And the film reiterates key lines in such a way that draws on audiences' familiarity with the 1973 film for horror a la parody, but it frames them in such a way that we're meant to acknowledge their pre-occurrence within the narrative world of the film, a la the sequel. And that its depictions of challenges to the faith, through the scandalous headlines about the backers, evoke that same scepticism towards the church as an early 70s modernist audience boasted, is but another interesting commonality, suggesting that these two films share a connection that is perhaps deeper than simple parody. So you see here on the slide my references. Hopefully you found this video interesting. Please do comment below. Have you seen The Exorcist? Have you seen Repossessed? And what do you make of the argument? I would love to hear your thoughts. Otherwise, make sure to like, make sure to subscribe, make sure to comment below as well if there's anything you'd like me to discuss, any videos you'd like me to make. I'm keen on sort of making those sort of analytical pieces that speak to you guys, so please do comment below. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you found this very interesting, and I'll look forward to seeing you all in the next one.